Today, we discuss the future of the factory with the book's author, Dr. Jostein. I'm sorry, I gotta start again. How do you pronounce the Haga?
Hauge.
Hauge. Okay, let
Yeah.
me do that again.
No
Jostein,
problem.
is that right? Jostein?
Yeah, that's
Jostein Hauge.
perfect.
Jostein Hauge. Okay. Today, we discuss the future of the factory with the book's author, Dr. Jostein Hauge. Hey everyone, my name is Jason Smith. I'm originally from sunny California, now living in beautiful Beijing. Today's guest, Dr. Jostein Hauge, is assistant professor at Cambridge and author of The Future of the Factory. You can find his website at theglobalcurrents.com, and he is on X, Hauge Jostein. Welcome to the Bridge to China.
Thank you so much for having me here, Jason. It's a
I'm
pleasure to be
delighted.
here.
Yeah, I see your content. I've been to some of your websites. You make amazing content. Lots of people are very interested in your perspectives. And I mean, I think makes a lot of sense. Development without factories doesn't seem plausible. I have some questions maybe about India later because I'm curious if they can skip industrialization. I'm sure you have opinions on it. Let's start with your book. What led you to specialize in industrialization and megatrends?
So my path to trying to understand industrialization was part of a broader interest in economic development. And as many of us know, if we look at history and economic history, we see that countries that have developed their economies have often gone through a process of industrialization. So that's where it all started, and I did my PhD on the subject of industrial policy and industrialization. And later on, I started this book project, and there were a lot of the motivation was a lot of things happening in the world economy at the moment in terms of technological changes, automation, globalization, ecological collapse, and so on, that started debates on, is industrialization going to look the same? What does these things we are seeing mean for industrial policy around the world, and so on. So that culminated in this book project, which is about how big global shifts, if and how they're changing industrialization.
Well, so what was your core motivation for writing this book? Do you have a particular angle, or do you think that people misunderstand the factory's role in the development of the modern economy?
To some degree, to some degree, people do. One part of the idea of the book was to really investigate the drivers and sources of growth. So, for example, there is this argument emerging that countries can develop based on services rather than manufacturing, that they can kind of skip industrialization, and this is something that I wanted to explore. Now that we are seeing increasing use of automation technology, there are also debates about can countries develop based on labor-intensive industrialization, or is it even possible for the manufacturing sector to absorb labor? And now that we're seeing production becoming globalized, there are also important questions about who gets the value in these global supply chains and global value chains. Who really profits, who benefits, and especially there are important questions to ask regarding this with respect to the distribution of profits and the distribution of value between richer countries and poorer countries in global value chains, between corporations in wealthier nations and firms in poorer nations. So these were some of the core questions that motivated me.
Well, before we get to can a country skip industrialization and go directly to being a service economy, I'm actually really curious about, it does seem industrialization leaves where labor becomes expensive. That seems to be a trend that we have seen. I mean, it may not always be true, but do you think that industrialization will eventually leave places like China and move to where labor is cheaper? Or what are the factors that are causing manufacturing to stay and linger in China for so long?
I think there is a sort of a natural process whereby the services and the service economy starts occupying a larger share of an economy as it industrializes. So as a country starts developing, first, if you have an industrialization-based model, export increases, eventually thereafter consumption increases. This gives rise to a lot more domestic services that feeds into this consumption. So if you look at kind of the national accounts, it's inevitable that services will make up a larger share of the economy. And if you look at all wealthy nations in the world right now, services make up the major share of the economy. But deindustrialization can take many different forms. So Germany, for example, its share of manufacturing in the economy is lower than that of China, yet Germany still has a very strong manufacturing sector. Same for Japan, has a very strong manufacturing sector, although services make up an increasing share of the economy. So, if we see, for example, in China, and this is to be expected, I think, at some point, that manufacturing will not keep increasing as its share of the economy indefinitely. That doesn't mean that China will stop having a very strong manufacturing sector. I think we can expect to see labor in other parts of the economy and so on. But I think we also need to keep in mind that one part of this puzzle and understanding industrialization is sort of manufacturing's share of the economy and manufacturing employment. But part of the reason why manufacturing is so incredibly important is that it's often a part of an economy's broader innovation ecosystem. So if you think about a company like Apple in the United States, it doesn't really, well, on paper it makes iPhone, but does Apple contribute to, the America's manufacturing economy? Well, it mainly specializes in services at the moment, Apple itself. It does industrial design, research and development, and so on. So a country like the US has these strong capabilities in manufacturing related services that started with industrialization. And it's very good reason to believe that a country like China, and we're already seeing this now, it's going to build up a very important and competitive and cutting edge science and technology and service-based economy that is still connected to a broader manufacturing ecosystem.
I have so many questions, I don't even know where to begin, but let's just move on a little bit. Can you summarize some of the key megatrends that you explore in your book?
Sure. So I look at 4 megatrends. The first is the rise of services as an alternative to manufacturing in driving economic development. The second is the onset and the introduction of digital automation technologies and how that impacts labor displacement, especially in the manufacturing sector. The third is the globalization of production and what this means for distribution of revenue, profits, value worldwide. And the fourth is climate change and ecological collapse. There are 2 important arguments that I make in the book. And the first is based on these first 2 megatrends which have a lot to do with technological changes. Contrary to what many people claim, I say that manufacturing still matters a lot in building prosperity, in driving development, not only in developing countries, but also in wealthy countries. So this idea that countries can skip industrialization is something that I don't really believe in, and I don't think is borne out by evidence, except for in a few particular cases where you have very small economies specializing in niche services. And another important argument I make is that we see that power asymmetries in the world economy right now is dictating how much value certain countries are getting, or how much development you can actually attain from certain manufacturing activities. So, if you look in Southeast Asia, there are some strong manufacturing economies there, but that are perhaps at the danger of facing something that economists call the middle income trap. So you can manufacture things, you can assemble, you can have a strong manufacturing sector, but in this day and age, ultimately, if you don't climb up the value chain to having lead firms, to doing these high-end manufacturing services like design and also having the brands yourself, then there are limitations as to how far industrialization can take you. And that is exactly what we're seeing that China is doing right now, and so successfully. They started out with low-tech manufacturing, but now China is not only doing things on the terms of the transnational corporations that they initially invited to China, they are building their own companies that might eventually become global giants themselves, and some of them are in fact global giants already, like Huawei, like BYD.
Well, okay, I think I have three additional questions. Number one, I'd like to ask. I mean, I'm guessing as a non-economist that the price of labor is one of the factors when we consider whether deindustrialization would happen. So, because China's labor is becoming more expensive, but at the same time, and this goes to one of the megatrends in your book, China has 50% of manufacturing robots in the entire world in Chinese manufacturing. So is it possible that China can avoid some level of deindustrialization, even though labor is becoming more expensive, by having what they call dark factories, basically factories where humans aren't even necessary for most of the process?
Yes, I think this is entirely possible, and this is also consistent with past trajectories of industrialization, where we've seen countries retain a strong manufacturing base, like for example in South Korea or in Japan, right? These were countries that moved towards more what we call capital-intensive industrialization or capital-intensive manufacturing activities, meaning that you use essentially more capital equipment in the manufacturing process and less labor. And we are already seeing that some of these more labor-intensive, low-cost, low-tech manufacturing activities that initially took place in China are moving to countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, so on. But you make a really good point. China has one of the highest numbers of industrial robots in the world. They employ lots of advanced technology in its manufacturing process. And this also enables China's industrialization process to be dynamic, and China's manufacturing sector to be dynamic. So we are in fact seeing that labor's share. So China still has many people employed in manufacturing, which goes to sort of prove the strength of this labor-intensive manufacturing model, but they are moving towards a more capital-intensive model. And I think we are seeing, in fact, proof that you can retain manufacturing, you can avoid deindustrialization, even as labor costs increase, because there is labor-intensive manufacturing, there's capital-intensive manufacturing, there are many different segments of manufacturing, and it's all about being dynamic and adapting. And which China is relatively successfully doing now.
One of the things I've noticed under the Belt and Road Initiative is China is building special economic zones in developing countries, especially in Africa, Southeast Asia, actually all over the place. And this is bringing Chinese manufacturing along with European manufacturing, basically anyone who wants to invest into these developing countries. And a lot of the the technologies that they're developing are things that China maybe isn't developing anymore, or it's to develop in another place, like BYD has factories elsewhere as well. Does this afford low-income countries the ability to develop their economies and to grow their GDP and to help their people, or not?
It can do that. It's not a clear-cut yes and no. In the past, we've seen that when, for example, wealthy countries set up these kinds of special economic zones, unless tacit knowledge, unless capabilities capabilities related to production processes other than just mere assembly starts developing there, then these activities become footloose. And when wages rise, these companies that are setting up special economic zones may go elsewhere if they find that lucrative. So in Mexico, for example, this happened when China came onto the stage. So a lot of US companies had set up special economic zones in Mexico, in the computer industry, in Guadalajara, for example. And then China became a member of the World Trade Organization. It became more lucrative for some of these companies to move operations to China, and the manufacturing spell in Mexico was short-lived. But China's approach is to trade ties, to developing economic ties, and also investment in developing countries has proven to be slightly different from the way especially Western nations have developed ties to other countries in the global South. So China has, based on the research that I've read on this, seems more willing to invest in infrastructure that is necessary to develop manufacturing capabilities. Especially in sub-Saharan Africa, there's stronger evidence of spillovers from Chinese firm in manufacturing to other sectors of the economy. So while there's no clear-cut yes or no, this will be a springboard for industrialization. It's often, a lot of it is up to what the whole host government and host country that China is investing in does in terms of industrial policy themselves, right? But it is, China's building these partnerships that I think is proving to be more positive for the host country, especially in terms of developing infrastructure necessary for further industrialization.
Can we talk about India for a moment? Because, for us non-economists, the word on the street, with the discourse that goes around, is that India is able to skip manufacturing and go to a service-based economy. And when we look at the GDP growth in India, they're astounding numbers for the last few years. What do you think that India has enough industrial base to continue its growth? Can it skip industrialization? Is a service-based economy possible there? What are your thoughts? What do we not understand as non-economists?
First, I think it's important to discuss these GDP numbers a bit. Yes, India has had impressive growth, but if you look at it in per capita terms, which is what we should be interested in if we're interested in economic development, say if we compare India's GDP per capita growth since 1980 to China's per capita growth in 1980, I'm saying China because they are the same size as India, they were roughly at the same level of GDP per capita around 1980, China has been far more impressive. So yes, there has been some growth in India, but I think we need to dampen our hype a bit about India's economic development trajectory. The per capita economic growth, the per capita GDP level at this point is still quite low if we compare it to countries like China or Malaysia, or who are at that higher middle income level, or even lower high income level. India has experienced some success based on developing services. So if you go to cities like Hyderabad or Bangalore, you'll see services-based development that is actually exportable. So it generates some export earnings in the IT sector. In some instances, services that revolve around developing computer software, so also not only low-skilled services, but also high-skilled services. So there are pockets of success in India based on service-led development. But as India has developed, the trade surplus that they've generated in services is very far from making up for the trade deficit in goods. So there are trade balance constraints in India because it hasn't developed its manufacturing sector, its competitive manufacturing sector enough. There are also limitations as to the labor absorption that services can achieve, especially because in the manufacturing sector you have stronger potential for economies of scale. So there are walls that India are going to hit in terms of generating export earnings, in terms of employing people, and also in terms of technological development, because as I said earlier in our conversation, at its most countries' innovation ecosystems revolve around production and around manufacturing. And this is very clear, actually, if you look at different sectors' R&D intensity, and I have this statistic in my book, you'll see that there is much higher research and development intensity in manufacturing than in services. So if you want to really develop your economy as a science and technology economy, as a knowledge economy in a way, it's, you'll be wrong to completely think that you can develop only based on services and not manufacturing. Now, this is all not to say that services don't matter. Services, of course, matter. And India is proving that you can achieve something based on services. But I think this divergent approach and also divergent outcomes between China and India in the last 50 years really proves why, and also how manufacturing is the key driver of economic development, at least in initial stages.
As we look around the world, we're still seeing a couple of billion people who desperately need their economic per capita status raised all over the world. So, when we're looking at a lot of low-income countries around the world who are looking to China and thinking, I want that, what lessons can African and Latin American countries draw from East Asian industrialization?
So I want to be clear that all countries should obviously pursue unique paths. And when we look at China's experience, it is a very unique experience. And we need to understand the shortcomings of thinking that other countries can simply emulate China. But I do think there are a lot of really good lessons we can draw from China. And I'm also very happy to see what China has achieved, because that kind of gives us, for those of us interested in economic development and in seeing the global south emerging economically, gives us a bit bigger toolbox of what developing countries can do in the contemporary economy. One aspect of China's development that I think is very important is the role of the state in economic development and state ownership in economic development. Now, while there's no guarantee that state intervention in markets succeeds, or that state ownership in the economy is always successful, it is a necessary component. If we look at what happened during heavy liberalization in sub-Saharan Africa and also Latin America in the 1980s, it was devastating for the industrialization prospects and economic development prospects of those countries. It completely eroded the industrial base in most countries in Africa and also Latin America. So that's one clear, I think, lesson that countries should draw from China, is that as a developing country, and also if you want to retain some autonomy, strategic sovereignty, and autonomy here, especially from multinational capital dictating all the terms, you need a state that at least has control over the commanding heights of the economy. Another really interesting aspect of China's economic development has been the way they formed partnerships with foreign companies when they started attracting foreign companies in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s through joint ventures. So the state insisted on setting up joint ventures with a lot of foreign companies, for example, between SOEs, state-owned enterprises, and foreign companies, in order to make technology transfer more easily happen, in order to develop skills and so on. So the strategy of joint ventures and of local companies having a majority stake in a lot of these joint ventures has been very successful in China, and I think is something that other developing countries should look to learn from.
You mentioned this earlier, technology transfer so they can spill over to other parts of the economy. And you're bringing it up again now. One of the rumors, the way people like to frame things about China, is that it copies things or that it stole technology from Western companies. But the truth, and I think you kind of just touched upon it, is that these joint ventures, when Western companies were setting these up with Chinese SOEs and private companies, were agreed upon by Western companies as part of the deal to get access to, let's call it cheap labor in China at the time. So the tech transfers were not Chinese companies stealing, but were Western companies agreeing to give technology in exchange for access to Chinese markets. Is that right?
I I completely agree with you here. And for those of me for those following me on Twitter, they might have seen me have some issues with the words we use here and the framing around this uh, often around technology theft, which is a term that I think is misleading in terms of what's happened. So as you rightly point out, um, Chinese companies have gone into agreement with other companies, especially companies from the US, to set up joint ventures, for example, and also to transfer technology. And there has been uh, of course, there has been an element in China's early development process in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, especially, um, of China copying technology. And that is absolutely essential for countries that want to develop technologically. You know, given the huge discrepancy we have in technological capabilities between wealthy nations and poorer nations, the process of development has always entailed copying technology and transferring technology from wealthier nations. In fact, this is something that Germany did from Britain. This is something that the US relied on when it industrialized, copying and transferring technology from Britain, who was the industrial powerhouse at the time in the early 1800s. So China is not doing something new here. Um, and, you know, I have strong issues with this idea of technology theft because, you know, if you look at, say, a company like Apple, which has had huge operations in China, this company has benefited tremendously from the Chinese labor force. And even if Apple doesn't have any factories themselves, when an iPhone is sold, Apple takes home most of the retail price because of patenting technology, because of strong protection of intellectual property, and so on. So this accusation that developing countries, and for example countries like China and India, has stolen technology from Apple, completely misses the point here. In fact, and something that I've said publicly, is that I believe that a lot of technology in this sense is owed to poorer nations because of the crucial process that labor and firms in China has played in building companies like Apple and building these transnational giants that are based in the United States. And if you look at Silicon Valley today, what is the labor force made up of? A lot of people working in Silicon Valley are people who have been educated in Chinese universities, in Indian universities, building up these giants. So there hasn't really been technology theft enlarged by countries like China. If anything, I think large amounts of technology should actually be owed to these countries for helping building up technological giants in areas like Silicon Valley.
And going back to low income countries today, because China is an upper middle income country, I think that's how it's defined. There are still a lot of low income countries, and we talked about SOEs and Chinese companies and European companies setting up shop in these low income countries to in special economic zones and elsewhere. It would seems to me that it would be ideal, to go back to your point about spillover, for tech transfers to be part of those initiatives also. If you're setting up a factory in Sierra Leone, you should be training Sierra Leoneans on how that technology works and hoping that they can catch on and start by copying before innovating later. Is that, would you say that is a fair assessment of how to help low income countries develop?
Yes, I completely agree with you, with your point here. When wealthier nations set up these special economic zones in poorer nations, for example, China setting up a special economic zone in Sierra Leone or Ethiopia or another wealthier country doing the same, the way that this can work for Sierra Leone is having agreements in place for technology transfer. This is well established in the economic development literature that the way technology transfer often happens is through such agreements, like local content requirements, joint venture requirements, agreements on having local people in positions of developing skills, etc. This is very well established in the economic development literature, and it's funny how the language has changed a bit over time. It was almost unambiguously referred to as technology transfer, in the 2000s, in the 2010s. But now, as China has started, in a sense, here threatening the economic hegemony of the West and becoming a fierce economic competitor to wealthy nations, this language is slowly changing, and more people are prone to calling it technology theft, simply because of this this geopolitical circumstance that we're in right now.
You are kind of already, my next question, you already answered it in a way, but I want to ask it again so that it's very clear to people like me. That's what I try to do, make things simple for people like me. So there's something called the Washington Consensus, and this is what IMF and World Bank use when they come in to give loans to a low-income country, oftentimes when they need to be bailed out or they want a new project developed. They will be asked to liberalize their economy by making it accessible to corporations, taking assets that belong to the state, and then selling those off to international companies, making it faster to move money in and out of the economy, and following like a basically laissez-faire sort of model. Is this helping low-income countries develop? Yes or no? Why or why not?
No. I'm going to be very clear here. This is so I do think that the model has changed over time, and I don't think the IMF and the World Bank today operates like it did, for example, in the 1980s and early 1990s. But the Washington Consensus, which you are referring to here, so this refers to this quote-unquote unholy trinity of the IMF and the World Bank and the U.S. Treasury. And in the 1980s, late 70s, 1980s, a lot of developing countries were having problems with debt and got bailouts, loans from especially the World Bank and the IMF. And the conditions that came with these loans was heavy liberalization, dismantling of the state, also in line with much neoliberal ideology that was sweeping the world around this time. And if we look at the results that this had on these countries, for example, in Africa, we saw that GDP growth was negative in large parts of the 80s and early 1990s. You heard me right, negative. And this is something that we don't see very often, that GDP not only stagnates, but actually goes down into minuses. And if you talk to people at the IMF and the World Bank today, they will probably acknowledge that the results achieved weren't good, although they will probably not completely distance themselves from this model of privatization. So the Washington Consensus and the results of privatization in this time period were unambiguously disastrous for these countries. Now, this is not to say that, say, the state-led push that happened before in Africa in the 50s and 60s, in South America in the 50s and 60s, worked as well as it did, for example, in Korea. But this solution of heavy liberalization and privatization has never really worked. And I think also China proves that. You have people saying that, China developed because it started embracing capitalist markets and liberalizing. Yes, there was a period of liberalization in China, but China liberalized, and this is a very important point, China liberalized on its own terms. The state has had very strong control over the commanding heights of the economy, and also most aspects of the economy, directed investment and so on throughout its economic development period.
You keep using this term, and I know what you mean, but I'm assuming a lot of people don't. The commanding heights of the economy. So, let's go back to China China. A lot of people argue China is capitalist. China's people argue it's communist, it's socialist. It refers to itself as socialism with Chinese characteristics and a market. Wait a minute. Market socialism. So, I mean, what is China's economy? What are the commanding heights of the economy, and why is that so important to understand?
Yes, the never-ending debate and discussion on whether China is capitalist or socialist. I think it's important here to first define what capitalism is. So many people think of capitalism as markets, trade, and businesses in a private sector, and this is a bit misleading. These things have existed for hundreds of years, for thousands of years, you could argue, before capitalism emerged as an economic system to dominate the world. What I think the economic anthropologist David Graeber said it best by saying that when we think of capitalism, we should think of the means of production being controlled by private capital, by a small elite, by the major financial firms, by the 1%, so on. So it's about who controls the means of production, essentially. And in China, the means of production are controlled not by the for-profit private sector and the major financial firms, it's controlled by the state. And that is why I say that at its core, China is socialist, not capitalist. Yes, there is a private sector in China. There are thriving private companies in China. There are markets in China. China operates with the rest of the world through private markets, but the means of production is controlled by the state. And when I say the commanding heights of the economy, I'm thinking especially of the financial sector, the control over resources, the control over infrastructure. So these kind of pillars that really make up the most important parts of an economy, those are the commanding heights of the economy. And in China, the state is in control of those elements of the economy. And that is something you don't see to the same degree in the West. You have some countries, like where I'm from, Norway, where the state has more of a control over important. So another way to, instead of using the term commanding heights of the economy, we can say the state has control over important areas of the economy. But it makes China fundamentally different from, for example, the United States, where private finance has tremendous power. And this also, is, for example, why China can, extremely quickly switch directions, make investment decisions into new avenues like renewable energy, because you don't have to rely on the private sector saying, we think this is going to be profitable enough for us in the short term or to our shareholders. Because investment decisions and control over strategic resources are not in the hands of the for-profit private sector. And that is what makes China more fundamentally socialist than capitalist.
Yeah, I see that argument a lot with high-speed rail. People are like, "Oh, but it's not profitable." I think they're missing the point. But let's move on. You actually mentioned green energy, so I want to go there. What does your progressive framework for green industrial policy aim to achieve?
Thanks. So I assume here you're referring to a paper that I co-authored recently that was entitled A Progressive Framework for Green Industrial Policy. So me and my co-author of that paper, Jostein Hauge, we wrote this paper because we felt that the existing approaches to green industrial policy were largely aligned with this paradigm of green growth to solve the climate crisis. And the whole idea of green growth is that we need more growth, and the way we deal with the climate crisis is not by disbanding this idea of growth, but rather rely on technological solutions to support green growth. Now, there are some elements of this that work in terms of solving climate change, but we have three pillars that kind of challenge this existing view of green industrial policy. The first is that in addition to scaling up useful industries, which this traditional view of green growth and green industrial policy looks at, we also need to be talking about scaling down harmful industries. So, for example, in the Paris Climate Agreement, the fossil fuel industry isn't even mentioned. This is something, if we're serious about tackling climate change, we need to talk about more seriously. How can we scale down the fossil fuel industry? How can we scale down, the aviation industry to the extent that this is harming the environment? What about industrial beef industry and so on? The second element is about producing for public rather than private benefit. And this is where this discussion about capitalism and socialism is very central, because we are seeing that a lot of governments are tinkering in markets and trying to incentivize the private sector to switch to cleaner energy and to decarbonization, and essentially incentivizing the private sector to save us from ecological collapse. And this isn't actually working. And this is where we see the power of things like credit guidance and credit policy, where the state comes more strongly in. And it is absolutely no coincidence that the country that has achieved the most progress in clean energy investment, and the country that now makes up more than 50% of the market share in all clean energy device production, namely China, is also a country where the state directs investment rather than a for-profit private sector. And this is also part of what it means to produce for public rather than private benefit. And the third aspect of our progressive framework has to do with global ecological justice. So to some degree in this framework, we challenge the idea that countries always need to pursue growth. However, we say that wealthy nations should much more seriously question and rethink their approach to growth. However, we recognize that especially poorer nations actually need to grow more in order to satisfy material and social needs for its population. I think it's important that all of us, all over the world, stop this obsession with just GDP for GDP's sake. Obviously, growth should achieve something ecologically and socially, and those are the things that we should put at the center. But we also understand that growth in some parts of the world means better living standards for people, especially in poorer part of the world. So we say that poor countries should have more ecological policy space. They should have more space to design industrial policy the way they want. Sometimes it will rely on fossil fuel energy sources, but we need to understand from a global justice standpoint that poorer countries need to grow more and wealthier countries need to grow less.
U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen called China's solar panel development and manufacturing, what was it, excessive. Like there's too much coming out of China. But at the same time, we're looking at low-income countries are now able to skip over some degree of fossil fuel development and go straight to green energy, straight to solar panels, straight to wind, straight to hydropower in a lot of cases where China's helped develop hydropower. Do you think that China is producing too much green energy too fast and this is unfair to Western competitors? Or is it a great benefit to the world so that low-income countries can use less fossil fuels and be less reliant on fossil fuel imports?
I first want to say something about this idea that China is producing too much before we go on to talking specifically about clean energy. Now, China has been experiencing an export surge in recent years, a deliberate strategy, and I think this is a strategy that they should pursue because this is what development theory says that many developing countries should do, make things and export them. That is how countries have developed throughout history. These this idea of overcapacity, I believe, primarily is coming from other countries seeing now China increasingly as a competitive threat. So, other firms in other countries have very happily been importing things from China for a long time. It's not like China has forced these products onto them. The United States, Germany, the United Kingdom were very happy to import cheap stuff from China for a long time. And these accusations of producing too much and overcapacity only started coming when China started developing as an economic rival. So yes, China is producing a lot of things. To the degree that this is eroding other countries' ability to compete, I don't think it's correct to call it overcapacity. I would just simply say to other countries, and especially wealthy countries, well, why don't you do what you said China should do? Compete with China. Domestically, to the degree that production is happening at the expense of healthy inflation, and I know that there are some deflationary pressures now in China. I know that there are intense price competition between firms, falling property prices, falling consumer demand. I think these are domestic issues in China that should be taken seriously. But it would also be very surprising if domestic demand in China kept up with this incredibly rapid surge in exports. Now, let's move on to solar panels and clean energy devices specifically. Maybe you can convince me that in some sectors it makes sense to talk about industrial overcapacity by China. But when it comes to clean energy, it is nuts to say that we have too much clean energy in this age of climate crisis where we actually need more clean energy. The share of fossil fuels in total energy production has roughly remained the same globally for the past 15 years. We need a lot more clean energy. And there is one country that is actually helping us and a lot of countries achieve that right now, and that is China. And it is wonderful, I think, to see all these clean energy devices, especially being exported to other global south countries. Why is it wonderful? Well, when you import fossil fuels as a developing country, you become dependent on it. So, for example, part of what caused the debt crisis and in the global south in the 1980s was an oil shock, because a lot of countries were dependent on importing oil. If you have enough installed capacity in clean energy, you will also come closer to achieve energy sovereignty. So even if these devices are coming from China, even if they're not built in the countries that deploy them, you only need to import one solar panel cell and have manpower to learn how to fix that cell in order to come closer to energy sovereignty. So the surging exports of solar panels we're seeing right now from China to many countries in Africa is great, not only for powering up Africa, which is one of the biggest bottlenecks for economic development in Africa, but also for African countries to achieve energy sovereignty.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think another part of it isn't just the lack of manufacturing capability to keep up with China, but I think the United States and other nations are very threatened by the fact that developing countries will no longer be as reliant on importing expensive fossil fuels. I think it's amazing. We talk about EVs also because it's related, and there are enormous fleets of EVs here in China. I see them all the time. I'm in them all the time. They are helping poor countries decarbonize. They're helping all countries that allow them in to decarbonize. What do you make of Chinese EV industry?
It's hugely impressive. Right now China is at the forefront of the electrical vehicle industry globally, and I don't think anyone saw this happen. Well, maybe some people, but a majority of people, especially in the West, didn't see this coming 10 years ago. I think Elon Musk was mocking the Chinese EV industry roughly 10 years ago. There are some memes about that going around on the internet. but it's been hugely impressive, and is a testament to again this machine of highly efficient industrial policy that China has on display. And right now, China has the largest, it has a majority of the EV market in the world. I believe also BYD has surpassed Tesla as the largest, as a company that sells the most electric vehicles. Yeah, it's hugely impressive. Obviously, in the West, I think we need, EVs are good. We need more. I say we need more electric buses rather than just electric private vehicles. As part of fighting climate change, and also as part of, there's this surge right now to find more and more cobalt and lithium to feed this battery industry for renewables, which is also somewhat worrying. But from the Chinese perspective, hugely impressive and hugely important to see the development of this EV industry. And like we talked about with the solar panel industry, to see what's happening in other countries that need these products. For example, in Nepal, where there are lots of EVs now, cheap EVs, thanks to China, because China is not only making clean energy products, they're also making cheap clean energy products that countries in the global south can afford. It's really good to see.
Yeah, I saw the statistic about Nepal too. I was really surprised at the degree to which Nepal was just importing EVs as opposed to ICE vehicles. It was quite surprising. I'm going to skip a couple questions because I think you already answered them. The U.S., you're an expert on the factory. The U.S. seeks to have more factories, to bring manufacturing home. Is the tariff war accomplishing that? And if not, what would?
I don't think the tariff war is accomplishing that, in short. Trump's rush. So I think we should go back maybe to 2018, Trump's first term, when tariffs and when industrial policy and when subsidies for the manufacturing sector in the US started kicking in for real. Many reasons here that accumulated over time, but that is when I believe that Trump and the US political elite started seeing China as a real threat. And I think the rise of China has, in large part, kickstarted this aggressive trade policy by the US. Maybe there were some rationales behind the tariffs, economic rationales in the Trump's first term. Biden continued the tariffs in his term, together also with the Chips and Science Act, and there seemed to be, again, an economic rationale there, especially on trying to make more semiconductors in the US and more clean energy devices as well, from Biden's side at least, because he put tariffs on imported clean energy. This time around, Trump's tariffs have been mayhem. They have been reckless, not only on China, but the rest of the world. Now we're even seeing India being slashed with 50% tariffs. It's crazy, because this is has been a hugely important partner for the US for many years. But who knows which turn these tariffs are going to take, because we've seen tariffs swing like a yo-yo in the last few months from Trump. So the tariffs seem like a strategy from Trump to sort of use as a negotiation tool for various foreign policy purposes, to also reduce the trade deficit, which he sees as important with many countries. But there isn't much sound economic rationale behind Trump's tariffs. Although there can be an economic rationale behind tariffs. There was, in the US in the 1800s, Alexander Hamilton, one of the founding fathers of the US, was a huge fan of tariffs. And it worked largely for the United States in the 1800s, but Trump hasn't really created an economic rationale behind them, because we are seeing that a lot of countries are slowly decoupling and becoming more careful with trading with the U.S. And one unintended consequence that maybe Trump should have seen is these tariffs have sped up innovation in China. So some people call it like a Sputnik. The U.S. trade policy has been a Sputnik moment for China, where China realized we need to race to become innovators because we are seeing that this other big economy that we have important trade ties with, namely the U.S., is increasingly adopting hawkish trade policy towards us. So there seems to be a consensus emerging right now that China is actually innovating faster because of U.S. trade policy. Now, that's the answer to your first question. Are tariffs working for the U.S.? And my answer to that is no. The way they are currently formulated, they are not really working for the U.S., at least in terms of building up an industrial base. But what can be working? Well, you had something called, and there's still something called the Chips and Science Act in the U.S., which was a plan adopted under the Biden administration to try and reinvigorate the semiconductor industry in the United States. I do think the United States has already quite strong capabilities in the semiconductor industry, maybe not in, say, silicon wafer manufacturing, where TSMC in Taiwan has stronger capabilities, but they're still an important player. And there seemed to be a moment where around the CHIPS Act, the word momentum was building up around more investment in semiconductor manufacturing, for example, in Arizona, getting TSMC to invest in the United States. Under the Trump administration, this is a bit more uncertain, given that in the U.S., every presidential administration kind of have to distance themselves from what the previous administration did, even if it was good. Mm-hmm. But let's see how this plays out. I do think if we're talking about manufacturing in the U.S. and reinvigoration of manufacturing in the U.S., it needs to be a strategic plan revolving around some trade policy and some subsidies. Right now, the trade policy seems to be all over the place, and the subsidies seem to be very uncertain. But I do think that maybe, especially with respect to semiconductors, we might see more capabilities being developed in the U.S. over time due to industrial policy in the U.S.
Wow. I think we can squeeze in one more question. That was quite comprehensive. I find this interesting because I'm not an economist. You've called neoclassical economists flat earthers, and recently you referred to the economics discipline as, and I'm just paraphrasing here, as being like scholasticism in the Middle Ages and being protected by a small group of elites. What do you mean?
So this was, me calling neoclassical economists flat earthers was a response to someone calling heterodox economists flat earthers. So to give you some context here, heterodox economists are economists that are sort of operate a bit outside of the mainstream of economics, who often are a bit more interdisciplinary, who dabble in sociology and geography to gain some insights into how the economy works, maybe also more eclectic with its use of methods and so on. The way economics today has developed is a discipline that is very uniform, that mostly teaches students one way to look at the economy through the neoclassical lens, often through a heavily model-based quantitative lens that, to be honest, isn't always rooted in the empirical reality of the world. So some economists in the mainstream feel like if you bring in too many of these heterodox perspectives, it's going to be, it's going to mess with this uniform approach that mainstream economics has created. So that was the response to me, saying that the heterodox economists are going to introduce flat Earth theory just because it's different theory. Now, if you look at, and I said, well, actually, neoclassical economists are the flat earthers. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look at neoclassical economics, which dominates mainstream economics education today, a lot of the models are actually not based in empirical evidence, like flat Earth theory, which is not based on empirical evidence, because as I hope we can agree, the Earth is not flat, it is round. If you look at for example, what you learn about minimum wage in economic theory, you will learn basic models that tell you that if you increase the minimum wage, unemployment increases. You will learn basic theories that tell you that if you have free trade, all countries benefit. It will give you basic theories that depicts a very, very simplified relationship between inflation and unemployment called the Phillips curve that doesn't hold up to reality. So that is basically what I meant when I say, well, actually, neoclassical economists are the flat earthers, because the models that they use are based on intuition rather than real empirical testing. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a great deal of sense. We are out of time. This was an amazing interview. I hope that we can get you back on to get your insights into the future of the world's economy as it unfolds. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me, Jason. It's been a pleasure.